Joining us now, professor of sociology and psychiatry and the director of the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at the Vanderbilt University, Dr. Jonathan Metzl. He's author of the new book with a provocative title, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Professor, it's great to see you. We won't talk about Vanderbilt basketball because I don't want to, as much as I love our school. I'm more interested in talking about your book. The title is Dying of Whiteness. Explain a little bit the premise, what you did and how you arrived at your thesis here.
Absolutely. So Dying of Whiteness basically is a story about how the politics that are supposed to make white America great again, if you look at the actual policies, end up making working class white lives harder, sicker, and in many instances shorter. I'm from Missouri. I grew up in Kansas City. Now I live in Tennessee. And I spent about 7 or 8 years tracking really what happens at the everyday level if you live in a state like that rejects the Affordable Care Act and cuts Medicaid expansion, if you live in a state that makes it very, very easy for people to get guns, or that has huge tax cuts that benefit wealthy people but cut schools, roads, and bridges where you live. And what I found was that far from making everyday life great for people, in fact, those politics ended up functioning almost like risk factors, like asbestos or secondhand smoke that actually shortened people's lifespans.
No, is it so? It's the idea basically is a great number of people in this country who voted for Donald Trump voted in essence for policies that work against them. Let's take the state of Tennessee, for example, where you live. What's a good example of that there?
Well, I spent a lot of time doing focus groups with people who were quite medically ill and would have benefited from, had the Medicaid expansion happened in Tennessee, had the state embraced the Affordable Care Act. And I thought, you know, the kind of premise was maybe when people are chronically ill at death's doorstep, this might be a time for them to actually think, gosh, I would like to have the benefits that the ACA is going to bring. But I found that even the most chronically ill people, in many instances, said, I'll never forget this. Somebody who was kind of had an oxygen mask and things like that, and said, I don't support the ACA because I don't want my tax dollars going to Mexicans and welfare queens. And so this idea of this kind of, this idea that people were going to take what was mine was powerful, even at this incredibly kind of epic moment in people's lives.
Ruth Marcus is in Washington with a question for you. Ruth?
So this is a very provocative book. It reminds me a little bit of the book from some years ago, What's the Matter with Kansas, that similarly identified people voting against what seemed to be in their economic and to some extent social self-interest. But I'm wondering if you have a theory of how to get beyond that. And as you say, you had these people in focus groups who needed the help that the ACA could give them, yet were rejecting it. I'm wondering if we should take them more seriously, in the sense that clearly some Trump voters and Republican voters are animated by social issues, by a sense of aggrievement at the role of government. How do you speak to them and change their minds? What did you glean in reporting your book about that?
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I think that the question of how to change people's minds was something that was kind of going through my head as I was doing a lot of the interviews for the book. And part of it I ended up feeling was that change, in part, had to come from within in a particular way. And by that, I mean, it can't be Democrats' job to go and try to say, we need to take care of your health, if there's not also a movement coming from within conservatism to say that actually conservative politics also should take care of working class people of all backgrounds. But I did also find that in the course of my interviews that there were, I mean, certainly some people were flat out voicing racial resentment, and they were saying basically, I don't care if it sinks my own ship, as long as it doesn't help other people. But there were a good number of other people with whom I spoke who said, gosh, maybe universal health care wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, or maybe we should have background checks when we have guns. But at those moments, they were in the focus groups kind of almost shouted out by the other people in the groups. And so it did teach me this lesson that there is a messaging that the GOP has done in which ideas like health care and guns and tax cuts become more than just public policies. They're actually almost white racial identities. And I became more and more frustrated because even though I think that that's problematic, I didn't see a ton of kind of counter messaging. In other words, the GOP and Trump were very effective at defining what whiteness was, but there was no counter message that people could fall back on.
Jonathan Capehart.
Well, Jonathan, I'm glad you said that because it plays into the question I wanted to ask you. I was at a conference and where someone was talking about how they couldn't understand how white women, the majority of them, voted for Donald Trump, and how could they do that because they were voting against their interests. And someone in response said, no, they were voting in their interests. They weren't voting as women. They were voting as white Americans. And so when you have something so strong as race that basically blinds people to policies that are for their own interests as well, how do you break through? Is it even possible to break through? Is it even possible for a counter message to break through to get them to change their minds, their hearts?
2 points quickly, because I know we're probably short on time, but I would say that on one hand, I do think that people often vote also based on the material realities of their lives. And so I do think that there's a particular form of messaging that helps working class people of all backgrounds. And I do think that the Democrats need to promote that message better in a particular way. In other words, I argue in the book that policies that hurt white Americans also hurt everybody else, and we can flip that and make policies that are better for people. But I would also say that I think we're in a hard moment to talk about race, but ultimately we need to have a much more broad conversation about whiteness. We can't just let Donald Trump define what it means to be white. There needs to be pushback on this point about race in America.
The book is Dying of Whiteness: How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Dr. Jonathan Metzl, thank you. Say hi to everybody at Vanderbilt for me.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
That does it for us this morning. Chris Jansen.